We tend to trust language more than borders, more than flags, sometimes even more than history itself. When we hear a language, we instinctively imagine a people behind it, their ancestors, migrations, victories, defeats. We assume that if a population speaks a certain language, their blood must carry the same story. Words, we believe, are echoes of ancestry. But what if that assumption is wrong? What if language is not a reliable witness at all? What if, in some of the most important regions on Earth, language survived, while the people never changed? This is the paradox at the heart of this story. Because over the last few decades, something unsettling has happened. As historians and linguists continue to map the past through texts, inscriptions, and reconstructed language families, geneticists quietly opened a second archive of history, one written not in words, but in DNA. And the two stories do not always agree. In some cases, they directly contradict each other. This is not a story about a single nation or a single group. It is about how entire populations can change the way they speak without changing who they are, biologically, ancestrally, and genetically. And it forces us to confront an uncomfortable possibility. Language can lie about history, the new detectives of the past. For most of human history, the past was reconstructed through two main tools: written records and spoken language. Linguists traced family trees of languages. Historians followed chronicles of empires, migrations, and conquests. But in the late 20th century, a new kind of investigator entered the scene: geneticists. Armed with DNA sequencing, population genetics, and ancient skeletons pulled from the ground, they began asking questions historians could not answer alone. Not what people said about their origins, but who their ancestors actually were. Unlike language, DNA does not adapt. It does not borrow grammar. It does not switch alphabets. It mutates slowly, following strict biological rules, passed down from parents to children over thousands of years. And once scientists learned how to read it, DNA revealed something disturbing. In region after region, the genetic continuity of populations remained stable, even when their languages changed completely. This meant that linguistic replacement did not always require demographic replacement. Words could conquer where armies did not. The illusion of ancestry through speech. Why do we trust language so deeply? Because language feels intimate. It shapes how we think, pray, sing, and remember. It is passed from parents to children every day, reinforced by community and identity. Over time, it becomes indistinguishable from who we believe we are. But language has one dangerous trait: it spreads easily. A small elite can impose it. A religion can preserve it. A trade network can normalize it. A school system can enforce it. Within a few generations, an entire population can abandon one language and adopt another without a single mass migration. Genetically, those people remain largely the same. Linguistically, they appear completely different. For centuries, historians assumed that when a new language dominated a region, it must reflect a new people arriving. New tongue, new blood. DNA is now telling us that this logic often fails. Bloodlines beneath the words. When geneticists compare populations, they do not look at culture or speech. They analyze patterns, shared mutations, inherited markers, and deep ancestral signatures that link communities across time. These patterns can persist even when everything else changes. Clothing changes. Religion changes. Political allegiance changes. Language changes. But DNA quietly carries the memory of who lived there before. This is where the story becomes unsettling, because in several well-known historical regions, the dominant language today does not match the genetic ancestry beneath it. Instead, the DNA points to continuity, sometimes stretching back thousands of years, while the spoken language reflects later cultural shifts. In other words, the people stayed, but the words moved. When identity is rewritten, this raises a deeper question. If language can change without ancestry changing, what does that mean for identity? Are people defined by the language they speak, or by the lineage they carry? For centuries, identity was anchored in visible markers: speech, customs, myths of origin. But genetics introduces a hidden dimension, one that does not always align with collective memory. And this misalignment can be deeply uncomfortable. because it suggests that many modern identities are layered, not false, but incomplete, built on cultural continuity rather than biological replacement. Language, in this sense, becomes a mask history wears, not deliberately deceptive, but selective. Setting the investigation, this documentary follows that hidden story, not by dismissing language, but by placing it on trial. Across multiple regions and populations, we will examine cases where linguistic history and genetic history tell different stories, where speech suggests one origin, but DNA reveals another. We will follow geneticists as detectives, tracing ancestral lines through Y-chromosomes and mitochondrial DNA. We will compare paternal inheritance to maternal inheritance. We will examine how migrations, elite dominance, religious conversion, and social prestige reshaped how people spoke, without necessarily reshaping who they were. And we will confront a central paradox. How can a language outlive the people who first spoke it? And how can a people survive while abandoning the language of their ancestors? The question that changes everything. So here is the question that frames this entire investigation. If language and blood tell different stories, which one should we trust? History written in books, or history written in chromosomes? Because once you accept that language can change faster than genes, the map of human history begins to shift. Borders blur. Migrations look different. And the story of who belongs where becomes far more complex than we were taught. The word survived, but the people did not necessarily change. And that realization forces us to rethink one of our deepest assumptions about the past. If language is the testimony, then DNA is the forensic evidence. And like many good investigations, the breakthrough comes not from stories, but from patterns. When geneticists began comparing populations across continents, they did not ask what languages people spoke. They asked simpler, colder questions. Which mutations do they share? How old are those mutations? And how widely are they distributed? Two genetic tools became central to this investigation. The first is the Y-chromosome, passed almost unchanged from father to son. It allows scientists to trace paternal ancestry thousands of years into the past. The second is mitochondrial DNA, inherited exclusively from the mother, preserving maternal lineages with similar depth. Together, they form a biological double-entry ledger, one paternal, one maternal, that records population history independently of culture, religion, or language. And when these tools were applied to linguistically defined populations, something unexpected emerged. Again and again, the genetic story refused to follow the linguistic one. The paternal line, deep roots, stable populations. Across large parts of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa, populations that today speak very different languages often share remarkably similar paternal genetic signatures. This suggests continuity. In many regions, the Y-chromosome lineages cluster locally and remain stable across millennia, even when languages change repeatedly above them. From a genetic perspective, this means that large-scale population replacement is rare. Most historical conquests did not involve millions of newcomers overwhelming the existing population. Instead, they involved small elites, rulers, administrators, religious authorities, imposing new languages on existing communities. The fathers stayed. The words changed. This pattern appears in region after region. Linguistic boundaries shift rapidly, while Y-chromosome lineages remain deeply rooted in place. Language, it turns out, can be conquered far more easily than people. The maternal line, assimilation written in DNA. Mitochondrial DNA adds another layer, and often reveals the social mechanics behind language change. In many cases, maternal lineages show greater local diversity than paternal ones. This suggests a common historical pattern. Incoming male elites marrying local women, while transmitting their language, religion, or status to the next generation. Over time, the language of the elite becomes dominant, even though most of the population's ancestry remains local. This process leaves a distinctive genetic fingerprint. Paternal lines point to a small external origin. Maternal lines remain overwhelmingly indigenous. Linguistically, the population appears transformed. Genetically, it is largely continuous. This explains how a language can spread without a mass migration, and why linguistic maps so often exaggerate the scale of demographic change. Language families versus genetic families. One of the most revealing moments in genetic research came when scientists overlaid linguistic family trees with genetic distance maps. If language truly tracked ancestry, these maps should align. They often do not. Populations speaking closely related languages may be genetically distant. Others speaking completely unrelated languages may be genetically close. This breaks one of the oldest assumptions in historical reconstruction, that language families equal biological families. Instead, DNA suggests something more complex. Languages behave like technologies. They are adopted, transmitted, modified, and abandoned based on power, utility, and prestige, not necessarily ancestry. Just as people can adopt new tools without changing who they are, they can adopt new languages without changing their genetic identity. Elite dominance. How few can change many. One recurring explanation emerges from both genetics and history. Elite dominance. A relatively small group, if socially powerful enough, can impose its language on a much larger population. Over generations, that language becomes universal, even if the elite's genetic contribution is minimal. From the outside, it looks like a new people arrived. From the inside, it is mostly the same people speaking differently. DNA exposes this illusion. The genetic continuity beneath linguistic replacement reveals that cultural transformation does not require biological transformation. Words travel faster than genes. When DNA contradicts the narrative, these findings have forced historians to revisit long-standing narratives. In some regions, written sources describe invasions, replacements, or disappearances of populations. Linguistic evidence appears to support these stories. But genetics often tells a quieter, more conservative tale. Populations rarely vanish. They adapt. They survive under new rulers, new religions, new administrative systems, and eventually, new languages. What disappears is not the people, but the memory of who they were. Language becomes the archive of power, not ancestry. From genes to maps. As genetic datasets expanded, researchers began reconstructing ancient population movements with unprecedented precision. Ancient DNA extracted from skeletons confirmed what modern DNA suggested: continuity beneath change. In many cases, genetic lineages in a region extend back thousands of years beyond the arrival of the dominant modern language. This means that when we look at a linguistic map today, we are often seeing the result of recent historical processes layered on top of ancient biological foundations. The surface tells one story. The substrate tells another. The crumbling assumption. By the early 21st century, a quiet consensus began forming among population geneticists. Language is not ancestry. Language is strategy. It reflects who held power, who controlled institutions, and whose children were taught which words, not necessarily who replaced whom. This realization does not make linguistic history irrelevant, but it does demote it from judge to witness. DNA, for the first time, allows us to cross-examine that witness, and the testimony is often contradictory. Setting up the case studies. With the tools of genetic investigation established, the next step is unavoidable. We must look at specific cases, real populations where language appears to tell one story, and DNA tells another. Not abstract models, not theoretical debates, but concrete examples where speech and blood diverge, because it is in those contradictions that the illusion becomes impossible to ignore. Once the tools of genetic investigation are in place, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Again and again, history presents the same contradiction. Languages change abruptly, while populations remain largely the same. To understand how deep this paradox runs, we must move from theory to real cases, places where linguistic identity suggests one origin, but DNA tells a far older, quieter story. These are not marginal examples. They sit at the center of world history. Case 1. Ashkenazi Jews and the Founder Effect. Few populations have been studied as intensively as Ashkenazi Jews. Linguistically, their historical language, Yiddish, points toward medieval Central and Eastern Europe. Germanic structure, Hebrew vocabulary, Slavic influences. For a long time, this linguistic evidence shaped assumptions about origin. If the language was European, Perhaps the people were largely European converts. Genetics complicated that picture. Y-chromosome studies consistently showed that a significant portion of Ashkenazi paternal lineages traced back to the Levant, the Eastern Mediterranean, thousands of years ago. These lineages closely resemble those found among other Jewish populations and neighboring Middle Eastern groups. The fathers pointed east. Mitochondrial DNA, however, told a different story. Many maternal lineages among Ashkenazi Jews trace back to Europe, particularly Southern Europe. This revealed a precise historical mechanism: Jewish men migrating from the Near East, marrying local women, and passing down a shared cultural and religious identity. Over generations, this produced a population that spoke a European language, lived in Europe, but carried deep Middle Eastern paternal ancestry. Language suggested assimilation. DNA revealed continuity. This is the founder effect in action. A small initial population expanding rapidly while preserving a narrow genetic signature. Linguistically European. Genetically layered. Historically coherent. Yiddish did not reflect biological origin. It reflected historical circumstance. Language as a cultural Trojan horse. The Ashkenazi case illustrates a broader truth. Language can spread horizontally across populations, rather than vertically through ancestry. In many historical contexts, adopting the language of a dominant group was not optional. It meant access to trade, protection, education, or survival. Once adopted, language reshapes identity within a few generations. Children no longer speak the old tongue. Memory fades. Origin myths adapt. But DNA remains indifferent to all of this. The bloodline quietly preserves what culture overwrites. Case 2. The Middle East and shared ancestry. Across the Levant, populations today speak different languages and identify with different religions. Arabic dominates linguistically. Hebrew was revived in the modern era. Aramaic survives only in pockets. For centuries, language was used to separate these communities into distinct historical narratives. Genetics dissolved those boundaries. DNA extracted from ancient skeletons and compared with modern populations revealed strong continuity across the region. Jewish, Arab, Christian, and Druze populations share significant ancestry tracing back to Bronze Age inhabitants of the Levant. Linguistically, these groups appear distinct. Genetically, they are cousins. The Arabization of the Middle East did not require the replacement of populations. It required administrative power, religious authority, and time. Arabic replaced earlier languages. People remained. Case 3. North Africa and the myth of total replacement. North Africa offers another striking example. Modern populations largely speak Arabic or Berber languages. Historical narratives often describe sweeping Arab invasions transforming the region. Genetics tells a subtler story. Most North African populations retain deep local ancestry dating back thousands of years, long before Arab expansion. The arrival of Arabic language and Islamic culture reshaped identity without erasing the population beneath it. Here again, language became the dominant signal of identity, while DNA preserved the older story. Words rewrote memory. Genes kept records. Case 4. Communities beyond the expected map. Perhaps the most philosophically revealing cases are found far from the traditional centers of Jewish or Middle Eastern history. Jewish communities in Ethiopia, India, and China present a striking pattern. Genetically, many of these groups closely resemble their local neighbors. Their DNA reflects regional ancestry rather than Middle Eastern origins. And yet, culturally and religiously, they preserved Jewish identity for centuries, sometimes millennia, without continuous genetic connection to the Levant. Here, the paradox flips. The language and rituals preserved identity, while DNA reflected local integration. Blood did not define belonging. Memory did. This forces a radical conclusion. Identity can persist without genetic continuity, just as genetics can persist without linguistic continuity. The collapse of a simple model. Taken together, these cases destroy a simplistic model of history. There is no universal rule that language equals ancestry. No guarantee that speech reveals blood. Sometimes language spreads without people moving. Sometimes people move without language surviving. Sometimes identity persists even when both change. What DNA reveals is not chaos, but complexity. Human history is layered. Language records power. Genes record survival. Why this matters? These findings are not academic trivia. They reshape how we understand nationalism, ethnicity, and belonging. They challenge narratives built solely on language. They complicate claims of purity, origin, and ownership. And they remind us that history is not written by a single archive. Words tell one story. Bones tell another. Only by listening to both can we approach the truth. Preparing the final question. If language can change without people changing, and identity can persist without genetic continuity, then what truly defines who we are? This is the question the final block must confront. Because once speech and blood are no longer aligned, identity becomes something far more fragile and far more human. At the end of this investigation, one conclusion becomes unavoidable. Identity is not a single thread. It is a weave. For centuries, we searched for human history in the most visible places: languages, chronicles, myths, and borders. These were the tools we had, and they shaped how we explained the past. Language, in particular, became a shortcut to ancestry. If people spoke a certain tongue, we assumed they must descend from those who first spoke it. Genetics shattered that simplicity. What DNA revealed was not a cleaner story, but a truer one. The two archives of humanity. Human history is preserved in two parallel archives. The first is cultural memory, language, religion, stories, traditions. It changes quickly. It adapts. It can be reshaped within generations. It is powerful precisely because it is flexible. The second is biological memory, DNA. It changes slowly. It resists ideology. It carries signatures that no empire, religion, or school system can fully erase. For most of history, we only had access to the first archive. Now we have both. And when we compare them, something remarkable happens. We begin to see not replacement, but continuity. Not disappearance, but survival. Language does not always tell us who replaced whom. Often, it tells us who ruled whom. Why language misleads us? Language feels ancient, but it is fragile. A single political shift can elevate one language and suppress another. A few centuries of administration, education, or religious authority can overwrite thousands of years of speech. Children adapt quickly. Within a short time, the old tongue survives only in fragments, songs, prayers, or place names. DNA does not behave that way. Even when languages vanish, genetic lineages persist. They flow quietly beneath the surface, indifferent to the words spoken above them. This is why language can mislead historians, not because it lies deliberately, but because it reflects power more than population. The illusion of clean origins. One of the most dangerous ideas inherited from earlier history is the belief in clean origins. Pure peoples, pure languages, pure lineages. Genetics dismantles this illusion completely. Human populations are mosaics. Every group is the product of migrations, marriages, assimilations, and adaptations. Even when identities appear stable, they are built on layers of change. Language often hides this complexity by presenting a single, unified narrative. DNA exposes the layers underneath, and those layers show us something humbling. Survival is far more common than replacement. Rethinking belonging. If language can change without ancestry changing, and ancestry can persist without language surviving, then belonging cannot be reduced to either one alone. This is the uncomfortable but liberating truth at the heart of genetic history. Belonging is negotiated. It emerges from shared memory, shared struggle, shared ritual, sometimes aligned with genetics, sometimes not, sometimes reinforced by blood, sometimes preserved by belief. In some communities, DNA anchors identity. In others, culture does. Neither is false. They are simply different dimensions of what it means to be human. What this changes about history. This new perspective forces us to rethink some of our most basic historical questions. Did populations vanish, or were they renamed? Did people migrate, or did power migrate over them? Did identity shift, or did language simply replace memory? Genetics does not erase history. It corrects it. It reminds us that history written only in words is incomplete, and sometimes misleading. The past was not a series of clean breaks. It was a continuous negotiation between survival and change. The quiet persistence of people. Perhaps the most striking lesson from DNA is how rarely people disappear. Empires fall. Languages fade. Borders dissolve. But people endure. They adapt to new rulers. They adopt new words. They carry old lineages forward under new names. In this sense, DNA is a record of resilience. It shows us that beneath the noise of history, wars, conquests, conversions, there is an extraordinary continuity of human life. The surface changes. The foundation remains. A personal question. This realization brings the story back to us. Because if language can lie about history, what does that mean for our own identities? How much of who we think we are comes from words we inherited? And how much comes from ancestors we never knew? Every person carries a private archive of history in their cells, a record that predates nations, religions, and languages. It connects us to people who never knew our names, never spoke our words, and never imagined the world we live in. And yet, without them, we would not exist. The final thought. History is not written only in books. It is written in chromosomes. Language tells us how people understood themselves. DNA tells us how they survived. Neither alone is enough. But together, they reveal a deeper truth. Humanity is not defined by purity, but by persistence. Not by static identity, but by continuity through change. The word survived. The people endured. And between them lies the real story of who we are.